Hi everyone, I'm Mari Quanbeck. I am a researcher at the National Center on Educational Outcomes, or NCEO, located at the University of Minnesota, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today to talk about statewide assessments and assessment accommodations for students with disabilities. I know you're all working in the trenches of this every day, so it's a really good group to have these conversations with. So I'm hoping to share some of the latest research we've been doing at NCEO, talk about some of the trends that we've been seeing, and then just open things up to discussion because I'm really curious also to hear what you're experiencing in your states. So, on that note, here is what we're going to briefly cover today. It is going to be pretty high level of all of these things, so if there are things that you want to dive into at the end, let me know. And I will also be sharing a number of resources throughout the presentation, and those will all be in the document that I will put into the chat at the end as well. So we're starting with just some basics of accommodations versus modifications, because that can be kind of muddy, before getting into some work on teacher and student perceptions of accommodations. Then we'll talk about some of the unintended consequences that we've been seeing as states have shifted from accommodations to accessibility frameworks. And then we will be looking at some more recent work on assessment accommodations, including NCEO resources and alternate assessment accommodations as well. And then we will finalize and wrap up with what we'd call hot topics, or the things that keep coming up in our conversations with states and just the overall trends that we're seeing. So we will jump right in. So first, we'll just start with some of the fundamentals, which you probably already know, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is a really brief report from NCO that you can access with that QR code, or if you go to our website and search Basics of Accommodations. Um, but basically, this diagram shows how we think about the relationship between accommodations and modifications for both instruction and assessment. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a different relationship. With instruction, you can have both accommodations and modifications, whereas for assessment, we really want to stay away from any of those modifications and stick with just accommodations. So we'll dive into quick definition of each of those just for clarification. So accommodations are really changes in the procedures or materials, and it does two things. The first is ensuring students have equitable access to the instructional and assessment content. So we want to make sure students can actually access what it is that we're presenting them with. And then the second piece is that accommodations support valid assessment results for the students who require them. And this is really the key piece here with accommodations versus modifications. Accommodations don't reduce or change the learning expectations. So one example of this might be if a student uses text-to-speech on a mathematics assessment. They're still able to demonstrate their understanding of the math, and we're just removing the barrier of having to read the math problem itself. So we can actually measure what we want to measure, which is their mathematics problem-solving abilities. In contrast, modifications change the learning expectations. And because they change this, they have to be really used with caution in instruction, and we should not use them during standardized assessment. Because if we use them during standardized assessments, that's fundamentally changing what's being measured. And so the scores that are produced are not, we can't make the same valid interpretations of those scores. So some examples of modifications would be things like if students have fewer learning objectives than their peers, if they have fewer assignments, or if on an assessment they have fewer items on the assessment that they have to complete. That's actually changing what's being measured rather than just increasing their access to the assessment. And we're just spending some time on this because we still see confusion about this in the field. And it really, especially in assessment, is important because the validity of those assessment results and interpretations are at stake. So now we're going to get into some of the more interesting pieces, I think. So we're going to talk about both teacher and student perceptions on accommodations. So we did a pretty extensive synthesis of research on teacher perceptions. Again, you can get to the report here. So we synthesized and summarized research on accommodations, teacher perceptions between 1999 and 2021. So pretty big span there. Um, and then also I mentioned on there's an accommodations toolkit, but I will discuss that later. Um, but so here is some of just the findings of what we found. This is just one example. As you can see, assistive technology, there were 7 studies identified. And one of the consistent themes is that teachers struggle to make assistive technology available to students because of their own discomfort, their lack of experience with the assistive technology, or just feeling like they don't know how to communicate to students how to use it, and they don't know how to teach the students how to use that technology. So this was just one example. If you want more details on the findings, the report has the whole table with this. Um, but then this chart shows a little bit more of a landscape of what we found from the teacher's perspective. So assistive technology actually had the most studies on teacher perceptions with the 7. But there were 12 accommodations that were addressed by only one study. And if we really look at this list, we can see a whole lot of accommodations that weren't addressed at all. And so these are accommodations that are being used, but we don't actually have any research about what teachers think about them or how they're implementing them. So that is definitely an area that we saw some room for more research. So we found both positive and negative perceptions and experiences that teachers have about this accommodations and making accessibility decisions, and we wanted to share a few of those with you. So overall, teachers did have pretty positive accommodations. And interestingly, they were able to identify the areas where they needed professional development. So the teachers are able to tell us where they need this assistance, and now we need to actually provide that for them. And of course, teachers are members of IEP teams who are making the accommodation decisions, so really important that they are knowledgeable and feel comfortable with making these decisions. Few of the talent challenges, a lot of teachers did recognize that making appropriate decisions isn't always easy. Specifically, a few of the accommodations that teachers identified as especially difficult for making decisions included assistive technology, oral delivery, whether that's human readers or text to speech, student reading aloud to self, scribe, translating test directions, and tactile graphics. So now that we have some of these challenges identified again, it's on to us as researchers to also figure out, well, how do we meet these needs? Additional challenges included having the teacher's philosophies and perceptions influencing what accommodations students have access to. So, depending on what the teachers feel about accommodations is going to influence what they allow in their classroom, which is really interesting. Um, and then also interesting was that specifically implementing accommodations for students with high incidence disabilities is an area that teachers need additional training. So some of these are the accommodations that are maybe going to be really common. There are a lot of students with these disabilities, and yet we still find that teachers are struggling to identify the appropriate accommodations. So the teacher quotes, I think, are really where some of the really juiciness of this is and the good stuff. So a lot of the teachers, a lot of the quotes are actually about ATs because there were so many studies on that. So first, getting all the devices or even most to operate correctly, consistently, and efficiently is another dilemma. And then keeping them running and current is usually a huge bugaboo. Another challenge was that one of the major hurdles is limited funding and ever-evolving new technologies, which I'm guessing is something that we can all relate to in our various agencies. Teachers also thought that they need to have more time in training programs, actually learning how to use these devices. And then they highlight the fact that they're asked to teach students how to use these, but then they are not given instruction on how to do so. So it's just adding additional burdens to the teachers to have to try to look up these tutorials and directions online so that they understand them and can teach them to their students. So a few of our suggested strategies based on this is involving all teachers in accessibility and accommodation decision making. So both general and special educators' perspectives should be included, and we need to make sure we solicit this input during IEP meetings. Additionally, understanding the teacher biases is really important since we saw in one of the other findings that their philosophies and perceptions are going to affect what they give students access to. So we need to understand what those biases are and how we may need to work around them. Additionally, there should be state guidelines or other frameworks for decision making. Our second is to provide professional development, specifically a lot of that on assistive technology and other technology-based accommodations. We saw through those quotes and the findings that teachers really need more training on this. They're just not feeling prepared to use it themselves and to teach students. So that's, I think, one of the biggest areas that we found from this as a future area of need. And then finally, our third is to gather information on how accessibility features and accommodations worked. So after the assessment, we should evaluate these decisions and collect feedback from the teachers on the decision-making process. Get feedback on the process itself, on how the implementation of the accommodations work, and how they felt the effectiveness of the accommodation worked during the assessment. And all of this additional feedback can then be used to inform policies and practices. So again, these are kind of just saying the same things as before, but we need these perspectives and we need teachers to be able to advocate for their professional development needs, which we have seen. Um, and these are some of the specific accommodations that we need that professional development in as well. So it's just a few areas in particular, but it was really seemed across the board. All right, that was a little bit of a whirlwind, but now we'll flip this and talk about the student side of things and what they're telling us about accommodations because their voices are just as important in this. So probably all aware of this, but how do accommodations help students with disabilities? So they're designed to remove the barriers to learning and testing, and to provide access to grade level curriculum. And it allows them to really demonstrate what they know and can do without altering the validity of assessment results. So this is basically what I said at the beginning, but there's just a really important piece here also of linking instructional and assessment accommodations because students need the opportunity to use and practice accommodations during instruction so that they're not brand new when they're testing. So that's an important piece here, I think, as well to remember about accommodations. So we use similar methods, synthesized research from 1999 to 2021, and a few interesting findings. So this is just comparing the teacher and student perceptions. And so we found that there were more studies on teacher perceptions. And also, interestingly, the most studied accommodation differed between the two. So assistive technology for teacher perceptions, whereas for student perceptions, it was more so text-to-speech and extended time. So this really highlights that we have different gaps in the research here. So we need to be really intentional about studying what students think and what teachers think and looking at where are those gaps? Where do we still need more insight? So overall, students had positive perceptions of accommodations, and they found that engaging in the process of selecting accommodations can actually help improve students' self-determination skills. Um, so it helps them have a more independent future by building those skills now and learning how to advocate for themselves, not just in the education setting, but also beyond. And student participation in IEP teams can also provide really important information about their needs and empower the students to take ownership of their learning. So it's really important to encourage them that they should have a voice in these meetings right alongside the teachers and everyone else involved. And some of the student quotes I think are really good here. So, feeling less frustrated working on the test, saying, I prefer to take my test with accommodations so no one gets me in trouble and there are no distractions. Heard that one a couple times. These are just powerful statements showing that students also know how these accommodations are helping them. So that's, I think, an important piece to remember. Despite this, there also were negative perceptions. Students didn't like being removed from their general education classroom. This came up a lot for students who really wanted to stay with their peers and didn't want to have to test in an alternate location. Also, students don't always like the use of materials and equipment that's really noticeable. So if they have additional materials on their desk that other students don't have, they worry that their peers are going to notice that and it's going to make them stand out. And that goes right along with the next one that there's a lot of concerns about the social stigma of accommodations and having attention called to students' disability. And then finally, here's one that I think we really need to pay attention to. Students reported very little input into AT decisions. So that's, I think, especially with the group here, of a lot of interest that students are feeling like they're not getting to have any input into what they're using on these assessments. So some of these quotes just highlight what those perceptions were. Are we different? Are others smarter than us? This feeling that by having the accommodation, they are othered from the students. The character speaking to me was a distraction. So for one student, this type of accommodation actually maybe was a hindrance for them. And then finally, test accommodations make me feel bad. Everyone should be treated the same. This one I think is also really interesting because I think it indicates that we don't always do a good job of helping students understand the purpose of accommodations either. Because if they're saying it makes them feel bad and everyone should be treated the same, they're not understanding what it is that this accommodation is doing for them and how it can help. So I think it really highlights for us that we need to do a better job of involving students in these decisions and making sure that they understand what the accommodations do and why they're important. So again, students reported that they didn't have a lot of input into AT decisions, but they really want support to be able to use AT better. This is an accommodation that they're interested in, they want to be using, but they feel also like they need that support, just like teachers are feeling. So some of the implications are pretty clear. Making sure, again, accommodations are individualized. Students should not receive accommodations just because they have a certain disability category. It really needs to meet their needs specifically. Their perceptions should be considered in the decision-making process. And again, this helps them build those self-advocacy skills that they'll be able to take with them outside of school as well. And finally, students should have the opportunity to try a variety of accommodations and provide feedback, which goes with measuring the effectiveness. After the, so they should have opportunity to try the accommodations beforehand so that they can make those informed decisions. And then afterwards, it's important to check back in on them, get feedback on how it worked, and assess the effectiveness. Did this accommodation actually improve scores? So a few suggested strategies are just really talking with students about these, involving them in the decision-making process, and teaching them those self-advocacy skills. They're not all going to be able to come into the IEP team meetings and easily express what their preferences and perceptions are. So it's important to take the time to also help them build those skills in those meetings. And finally, interviewing students following the administration of the assessment. Similar with teachers, it can just help us get a better idea of how was this actually implemented? What was the student feeling while they were using it? Did they actually find it useful? Did they find it distracting? We're not going to get all of those details just by looking at their scores and seeing if maybe this accommodation helped them. So it's really important to actually talk with them and get that feedback. All right. We're going to shift gears just a little bit. I apologize. I am kind of breezing through this. There's a lot of content, so do feel free to stop me at any point. Um, but we're going to talk now about the shift from accommodations to accessibility frameworks, because this is really where the field has been going. So there is a brief again NCEO has about this that can be useful, but we'll just kind of go through some of the main points now. So in 2004, IDEA required reporting on accommodations, and in the 2010s is when a lot of states started moving to some of the more technology-based assessments. With this move is really when we saw a lot of states moving to more tiered systems of accessibility. And so accommodation policies became accessibility policies. And so the kicker with all of this is that we've seen fewer accommodations being reported. So this might look familiar to a lot of you, but just briefly, this diagram really shows the paradigm shift to including these tiered levels. So we have first the biggest circle is universal features, which are the accessibility features or tools that are available to all students. They do not have to be identified ahead of time. It's not just for English learners or students with disabilities. Any students can use these. The next slightly smaller group of accessibility features then is designated features. So these are for students who need them as identified by an educator in advance. So it does not have to be a student with an IEP or with a 504 plan. It just has to be identified ahead of time by an adult that a student would benefit from these features. And then finally, the most narrow group, we have accommodations. And these are explicitly for students with disabilities, or we might have English learner accommodations as well, but they are in a plan explicitly written down, and they are just for the small group of students. So instead of just having these accommodations and having all of these features fall under that category, in recent years, it's really been this broadening so that some of these things that used to only be available for students with disabilities have now moved out to be considered designated features or universal features that any students could use, such as highlighter, I think, is a really common one that now is just a universal feature. So if students are taking an online assessment, it's just going to be in the toolbar. They'll have access to it no matter what. So, what do the data tell us about this shift in accommodations? We've seen that there's a lot of variability in the percentage of students with disabilities who are assigned accommodations. So, it used to be over a decade ago, some grade 8 rates ranged from like 0.5% of students with disabilities being assigned accommodations to almost 100% in both reading and math. And we still see huge variability in recent rates, or in recent years, but the content areas are a little bit more similar to each other now. So we just have a quick few figures so you can see you can't actually see the states along the bottom, but each uh, data point on here is a different state. and representing just the different percentage of students with disabilities receiving accommodations. So it's just a really huge difference as we can see. So this is reading language art or reading language arts, but it is very similar trend that we see here for math. Interestingly, so now this is a longitudinal graph for just four states picked out, but looking at their percentage of students with disabilities receiving accommodations over 10 years. And as you can see, there's some states that have decreased dramatically. So they had 60, 70% of students originally in 2010. And then by 2018, 2019, almost down to 0%. So this can occur because states that have shifted to this tiered system may look like their accommodation rates have plummeted, but that's not necessarily the case. It may just be because they're reporting differently. So that's where these unintended negative consequences can come in. State data drops may make it look like the states um, are giving fewer students with disabilities accommodations, which can result in them getting flagged by OSEP. But it's not necessarily the case that they're actually providing fewer accommodations. It's just that some of the features that used to be called accommodations are now designated features or universal features, and those are reported differently. So because of the change in classification, what students are receiving is just reported differently, which can make it look like there's a compliance issue. So that's one of the negative consequences. The other major negative potential consequence is that if these accessibility features are not accommodations, they might not be listed on IEPs anymore. And this can result in either students not receiving those features during instruction because maybe in assessment they're just built in, they're not anything the teacher would have to provide the students with. Whereas in instruction, even as a universal feature, maybe it's something that the teacher has to physically provide, such as a physical highlighter. Additionally, um, we see difficulties with this with post-secondary and assessments in education. If things are not on students' IEP forms when they're in K-12, are those going to transfer with them afterwards? Are those accommodations going to be granted to them if they move into post-secondary education spaces? This also can be a challenge even just with students moving between states. If states consider different things accommodations versus a universal feature, and a student moves from one state to the next, something that wasn't on their IEP form may not be offered to them in the state that they moved to. So it's really important that anything that the student needs is still included on their IEP, even if it is not classified as an accommodation in that state. Because if the student moves to another state, as long as it's on the IEP, it'll be a lot easier for them to be granted access to that.
So, Mari, in the chat,
Oh,
Tammy has been asking a series of questions.
I
Um,
apologize. Oops.
but one was about well, Tammy, can you go ahead and just unmute yourself and talk to Mari about what you want to know? Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
within the question that I had posed was earlier when you were talking about the confusion with accommodations moving towards accessibility within, I think you said the context of IEPs. However, in Section 504, those are more accommodations that are identified differently than IDEA specifies. So I was just wondering, could you clarify that piece of things? Were you only referring to IEPs? Were you including Section 504?
That is a good question. I was only talking about IEPs. I'm actually not very familiar with 504 plans and what is included with that, so I'm not entirely sure how this would be affecting that as well. But if you want, I could I can put you in contact with one of my colleagues who was really involved in this work, in this brief, and would probably be better able to answer your questions if that would
Thank
be
you so
helpful.
much. Yeah, and then I think the other one was just a comment where I think it seems Deborah also had said that there continues to be that confusion around if it's a universal feature, then why would I embed it in the IEP? Exactly what you said. However, under the law, for IDEA or Section 504 or, you name it, AT is any item, blah, blah, blah. So it's interesting that there continues to be confusion as to why or why you would not include it within the context of an IEP for a student that needs that feature or device.
I think that's a really good, very good point. And it's a really complicated space that we're still all trying to navigate. And if anyone does have ways that your state approaches this that seem to work really well, that is definitely something we would be interested in knowing. So feel free to please do reach out if that's the case. Are there more questions at this point while we're paused, or should I can keep going.
I think, Marv, the very thing
Oh,
that you said in one of your slides was this is a roadmap for the student. This is a picture in time. And just because you and your team here at this school have a clue what works, you can't send a student off without their roadmap and their tools.
exactly, exactly. And I think, yeah, it is the challenge of when things are how do you decide what is the most necessary to include on that? What are the things that the student always has to use? And I think that's also where some of discussing with the students their preferences and perceptions can come into place too, because if there's, a universal feature that they always are using, the IP team might not even know that. They might not realize it because it's a universal feature. So getting that feedback from the students and hearing about their perceptions is really important, I think, for that piece as well. So just a few things the states can do, requiring IEP teams to document and report even things that are not explicitly categorized as accommodations. Keeping track of the number of students with disabilities who are assigned designated features and who use universal features, especially with some of the online tests, you can get the test process data and click data, I think it's sometimes called, to see things about which universal features are students turning on, when are they actually using them. States can report on those numbers when they have them. And then finally, just providing training to LEA and school personnel on this paradigm shift and on the need for documentation. Because I think that's another thing is schools and teachers don't necessarily even know all of these shifts that are happening and the impact of it. So providing that training to them and letting them know why it's important to track these things is an important piece as well. Similarly, I think I've mentioned this before, but it's important to make sure that students are familiar with and have experience in the classroom and on practice tests using the accessibility features that will be provided during testing, and also provide information to districts to share with the parents about the paradigm shift, especially considering parents are hopefully actively engaged in the IEP process. So involving them, letting them know about this shift can help ensure that they're advocating for their child as well and advocating to make sure that their needs are met and documented in the IEP. IP teams, these are pretty similar, so I'm just going to kind of breeze through, but document all needed accessibility features, even if it's not under the accommodations. If you just can include a note somewhere of the additional accessibility features, that can be really beneficial. Ensuring that students are familiar with the features they're going to use during testing. Um, and checking that they actually are using these during instruction and assessment. All right, so I'm going to talk next about something that's been a really major focus of work recently, which is need for common language around accessibility features and accommodations. So since like 2016 at a post-session forum to the National Conference on Student Assessment, there have been a lot of discussions about this need for common language. The discussions highlighted that there's really fragmented terminology development. So classrooms versus vendors versus developers all have different language that can create really widespread confusion. Additionally, vendors sometimes change terms, while states might work with multiple vendors. So this can just make it really difficult when the language is different across all these different systems. So based on this, there was a recommendation to elicit stakeholder collaboration to develop some common language. So bringing together states, vendors, and accessibility experts to create that common terminology. So this is work that we undertook in 2023 and 2024, I believe. We had really good community participation. I think we had over 20 state education agencies participate, as well as both consortia members and vendors. And so we all got together and met in person once, and then had a couple virtual meetings, and through a really iterative process, created some standardized language. So just little background, CEDS is the Common Education Data Standards, which is a data management initiative with the purpose of streamlining data within educational systems. So they have a system online. It's a web-based, I'm not exactly sure what it's considered, but it's yeah, an online data system essentially. It has really a community of stakeholders who all work together and contribute to try to make it easier to work with and understand the data that we're using. So from this work, we defined 48 accessibility features, as well as 28 what we called extension elements and 99 option set descriptors. So all of this is available in NCEO report that you can access here. It's got a really comprehensive framework that we developed that states can use to standardize their terminology and documentation. So just a little screenshot from one of the appendices to see what we did. This here has the accessibility features on the left, and then a definition next to them. And then as you can see, the farthest column is extended element. So that, not all of them are going to have that, but that's basically things that further narrow in on the specifics of that accessibility feature.
Mari,
So
can you
for
give me an example of an extended element?
yes, absolutely. So for this one here, the accessibility feature would be a calculator. The extended element then is the type of calculator
Oh,
because there might be a number of different ones depending on age level, type of test. So then those different elements would be the different types of calculators. It is a little bit confusing, like just looking at it from the start, but there's a big table at the back that has all of the accessibility features that we came up with, and I definitely recommend looking at it. It was a huge undertaking, a lot of iterative work and collaboration, but I think it was a really useful and valuable process.
calculator was the perfect example for me of understanding extended
Mhm.
uh, definitions. So extended elements. So thank you for that. That I went,
Absolutely.
oh, that. Okay.
Good. I'll kind of be wrapping up here this next few minutes, but I wanted to really highlight now some NCEO resources that I think could be really helpful. So I alluded to this before, but we have something that we call the Accommodations Toolkit. It's right on the big NCEO home webpage. There will be a link on the right. I will also, in the documents that I'll share in the chat, there are links to that as well. But our accommodations toolkit has research and policy summaries of 29 accommodations and accessibility features. So the research summaries have information about the major findings on use, implementation, and perceptions. And then the policies summarize the categories, so which tier it is of accommodation, and for each content area, so math, science, and English language arts across states. So this is a really good place to look if you're wondering what other states are doing, because you can go and find exactly what their policy is. So we have these for, I believe, 29 accommodations and accessibility features right now, and we're in the process of updating some of the research policies. So in the coming months, there will be a few updates to some of those. But I really recommend checking it out. This is what the webpage of that looks like, and you can see on the left the list under each. There's a research and a policy. So that's a really good resource if you want to know sort of a snapshot of across the country what does this look like. Additionally, NCEO does yearly literature reviews of accommodations research. So we specifically look, yeah, only at assessment accommodations for students with disabilities and summarize major characteristics of the studies. And we do this every year. So this um, these are our most recent three. The 2024 is in publication right now, and the 2025 is being written. But these are just, again, broad, high-level summaries of the research on accommodations. All right, next we have a number of forum reports that I think I pulled out ones that would be of specific interest to this group. So in 2022, so a little background, the forum, every year at the National Conference on Student Assessment, NCEO partners with CCSSO to hold a post-conference forum on a topic of interest. And so these are the topics from the past 4 years. We had assistive technology interoperability as one, meaningful accessibility overall. 2024 was harnessing AI for inclusive learning, and we actually had Gail as one of our speakers for that, which was wonderful. And then this past year, we had At a Crossroads, the intersection of AT, AAC, and AI, and actually Mia was one of our speakers for that as well. So I highly recommend checking these out and just giving an idea. They include information about the presentations from the forum as well as discussions that are breakout discussions that we facilitate at the end of the forum as well. So another good resource. We also wanted to give a little plug for our friends at Academy, Ocali AEM Center. They have a new resource out that is also very relevant. So Braille accessibility and state assessments. So this is updated guidelines for high quality Braille and tactile graphics on state assessments. It's really aimed to target SEA and LEA staff, assessment vendors, media producers. And it's about ensuring that appropriate accommodations are there for Braille reading students. And I think this is especially timely because one of the hot topics that I will actually discuss is that there's a lot of concern about equitable access for students with sensory disabilities, including blindness or low vision. So very timely resource as well. And finally, to wrap up, I'll discuss really briefly some bits about alternate assessment accommodations because we've been talking about accommodations really broadly, but then we also have this alternate assessment for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities that we want to talk about as well. So we have a report on this that you can get from this QR code or link. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through these a little bit.
Well, we've got a half an
We do
hour
have-
left.
Okay, excellent. Um, so this report was both a policy and a research analysis. So the first part was analyzing state policies to examine the extent to which states include alternate assessment accommodation policies on their websites. where they're documenting these and what accommodations are they actually providing. So we identified, for our second study, we identified and summarized research studies addressing alternate assessment accommodations from 2000 through 2023. And with this, we analyzed the characteristics and synthesized the major findings. So from the policy analysis, we find first that 49 of 51 states had publicly available alternate assessment accommodation policies, which was really good. There were a couple that had them behind locked paywalls or just were in the process of updating. But almost all states did have accommodation policies. We found most had at least two policy documents, and also there was significant variation in the terminology used across states, which again goes back to the work with CEDS on developing common terminology. We also found that policy information was often pretty difficult to locate within state websites and documents, so it was not in the same place for every state. Sometimes it took a lot of digging to actually find where they have this information. So this chart shows the most frequently identified accommodations in alternate assessment accommodation policies. So signed administration was the most common, followed by magnification and assistive technology, human readers, scribes, manipulatives, and calculators. We also found, really interestingly, that 48 states specified accessibility supports built directly into test designer procedures. So this is again getting a little bit to that shift in paradigms, but this was not something we'd necessarily expected. We sent out verifications to all states after we had completed our policy analysis, and when we got those back, it came back that a lot of states identified things, supports that we had not initially identified. And this is because they're considered to be built directly into the test design or procedures. For example, alternate response methods represented the most common built-in feature with 35 states saying that allowing alternate methods for responding is just part of the assessment. It's not an accommodation or anything. Assistive technology was identified by 33 states and brake steering testing identified by 30. So interestingly, again, documentation was sometimes inconsistent within these states. So it would be described differently in one section of a document versus another, or from one document to another, which was a little bit confusing. And we can only imagine how much more confusion that would create for teachers or parents or IEP teams who are looking for this information. For study two, what really stuck out was that there were only 6 research studies that met our inclusion criteria between 2000 and 2023. So only 6 studies in 20 years. We also found that most studies relied on secondary data analysis rather than original data collection, and 3 of those 6 specifically focused on students with visual impairments, which is not particularly representative based on the group of students who participate in alternate assessments. We found that there were, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. It took me a minute to register what you just said.
It's quite a gap in the research. I mean, we know these students are getting accommodations, and yet there is only research on 6 of them. That's
Uh-huh.
concerning. So we saw, yeah, there's a really substantial gap between policy implementation and research investigation because all of these accommodations have policies. They're being used, and yet there's very little research we actually have on them. So the implications from all of this is really that we need greater consistency in approaches to documenting policies, in the terminology used, and in documents within individual states. We also think future research should examine the effects of specific accommodations for different student subgroups. As I mentioned, three of the studies looked at students with visual impairments, which is not really proportional to uh, the, the population of students that participate in this assessment. So there's really need to look at some of these other student subgroups. And finally, research on best practices should really drive selection and implementation processes, but that's hard to do when there isn't actually research out there. So again, just this need to fill in those gaps. So there are some really significant opportunities for improvement in policy documentation and really a lot of room for development in the research base on alternate accommodations. And all of this points to the fact that there needs to be better coordination across research policy and practice to actually ensure appropriate accessibility and valid results. So to wrap up, we're just going to kind of highlight what it is that's keeping people up at night these days. So NCO is really fortunate. We participate in CCSSO's ACES Collaborative Assessment Standards and Education of Students with Disabilities. So we get to work and discuss with a lot of state leaders in assessment and special education, and they can really provide us some insight into what they're dealing with in their state. So that's where some of these hot topics have come from. So first, probably no surprise, remote and virtual test administration. This really accelerated during the COVID pandemic, and it doesn't seem to be going away. So we need more policies and practices that address it, especially things like how do you ensure test security during virtual test administration? How do you make sure students are still getting the accommodations that they need during remote and virtual test administration? Second, alternate assessment and the 1% cap is still very much something states are grappling with. NCEO actually also has a community of practice on this topic specifically because it just continues to be a big struggle for states and not something that's going away. Third big hot topic, this is one I alluded to earlier, is providing full access to assessments to students who are blind or visually impaired or deaf and hard of hearing. States are really struggling to make sure that assessments are accessible for these students and that they have the accommodations necessary as well. And so this is a direction that we've been seeing a lot of states moving recently and working on. Again, interoperability of AT and AAC devices with assessments. This is something that's come up time and again with states and in our forums. Students have this assistive technology that maybe works well in the classroom, but then doesn't work with the assessment platform. And so what do you do there? Um, so that's another big challenge. And then finally, the one we've been talking about throughout is the shifting accommodations. So accommodations that used to be considered accommodations, but now they're universal features, and creating just a lot of challenges and confusion around documentation and what we actually need to be recording. Oh, so that really is the end of what I had. So I wanted to open it up. I know I threw a lot of information at you, but we have time for questions and discussions. So I want to hear from you. What are you seeing in your states? What challenges are you running into? What's working well? And what questions do you have for me and for each other?